Before the Jedi ever built their first temple, and before any war ever tore through the stars, something was already moving through the galaxy that nobody had words to describe. This is the story of the Whills, and it starts long before anyone ever spoke that name. The Force is described in the oldest records as a mysterious energy field created by life itself. It binds the galaxy together, granting extraordinary abilities to those who learn to work with it. And according to every tradition that ever studied it, the Force has a will of its own. It is not just a tool that beings pick up when they need it. The Force moves in its own directions, pursues its own goals, and has been chased by scholars and mystics across the galaxy for thousands of years. For all of that time, nobody agreed on where it came from. Jedi scholars spent generations trying to answer that question and never landed on a single origin story. Every tradition they studied pointed somewhere slightly different. Some pointed to ancient civilizations on worlds long forgotten by recorded history. Others pointed to places beyond the farthest edges of the galactic frontier, worlds that no explorer had ever mapped and that no surviving record had ever confirmed. The Jedi themselves acknowledged that the deepest secrets of the Force might still be out there waiting, hidden in places nobody had thought to look. That uncertainty is not a gap in the story. It is part of the story. But here is what the Jedi did figure out, and it changed everything about how they understood themselves and their abilities. The Force does not just exist as some invisible energy floating in the air around you. It lives inside you. Specifically, it lives inside microscopic life forms called midichlorians, which are found within the living cells of every being in the galaxy. These tiny organisms are not just passengers drifting along inside the body. They are partners in something much larger than any single life form could ever be on its own. The Jedi believed that midichlorians were the key to understanding the Force, because these microscopic beings communicated the will of the Force directly to those who could listen. This was not a loose spiritual idea that teachers talked around in training rooms. It was the foundation of how the Jedi taught their students for generations. A being with a high concentration of midichlorians in their cells had a greater natural potential to sense the Force and develop abilities through it. The Jedi measured this carefully because those numbers told them something important about what any given student might one day become. But midichlorians were always more than a measuring stick. According to George Lucas, the person who built this mythology from the ground up, midichlorians exist in a symbiotic relationship with the cells they live inside. They are fully intertwined with their hosts. The way any living being connects to the larger energy field that binds the galaxy together happens specifically through those midichlorians. They are the bridge between the biology inside a living body and something far older and far bigger than any body could contain. Lucas described this connection in an interview reported in 2018 in a conversation with filmmaker James Cameron. He laid out a vision for what the Force actually is at its most fundamental level, one that operates beneath everything visible, at a layer of existence most beings in the galaxy never thought to consider. In that vision, living beings are vessels. The midichlorians inside them are the channel through which everything flows. And through that channel, something called the Whills communicates with all living things. Now here is where the story splits into two separate tracks, and keeping those tracks separate is essential to understanding everything that follows. In the official Star Wars canon, the relationship between midichlorians and the Force stops at communication. The Jedi believed midichlorians carried the will of the Force to those who were open to receiving it. That relationship was something Jedi were taught to approach through meditation and years of careful discipline. They learned to sit quietly with that internal connection and follow where it pointed them, treating that guidance as something to be listened to. In the larger vision that Lucas described in interviews but never fully brought to the screen, the relationship extends one level further. He described a microbiotic world where the Whills feed off the Force, and in doing so shape how the Force moves through the galaxy. Living beings, in this vision, are vehicles for the Whills. Midichlorians are the conduit. Lucas described the Whills in a broad sense as being the Force itself, the underlying intelligence behind everything that Force users across the galaxy had been reaching toward without fully understanding what they were reaching for. Both of these tracks are real parts of this story. One is the version that made it into the official stories, where Whills is the name attached to religious traditions and devoted orders of warriors and monks gathered on a moon called Jedha. The other is the version Lucas kept returning to privately, where the Whills are the hidden architecture of all existence, operating in a microscopic layer of reality that most beings never knew existed. This is where the story of the Whills begins. Not in any grand hall or famous battle. It begins inside a living cell, with organisms so small that most beings never thought to look for them. Everything that follows, every faith, every guardian, every act of devotion stretching across thousands of years, all of it flows from what those tiny organisms were connected to. The galaxy had a hidden layer, and someone was eventually going to find it. There is a small moon in a distant corner of the galaxy that people from every walk of life, every faith, and every background have been traveling to for longer than anyone can remember. They do not come for trade. They do not come for work. They come because something happened on this moon a very long time ago, and the memory of it never faded. The moon is called Jedha. In the official record, Jedha is identified as the home of one of the first civilizations in the galaxy to seriously explore the nature of the Force. Not study it casually, not mention it in passing the way travelers swap stories around a fire. Actually sit down with it, dig into it, try to understand what it was and what it wanted. That distinction matters. Most places in the galaxy spent their earliest histories figuring out how to grow food, build shelter, and stop fighting their neighbors. Jedha was doing something else. The people who lived there were asking a different kind of question. And because they asked it so early, and because they built their entire culture around trying to answer it, Jedha became something the rest of the galaxy eventually came looking for. A place to think, a place to listen, a place to feel something bigger than everyday life. The holy city of Jedha, sometimes called Jedha, grew up as the center of all of this. It became a pilgrimage destination drawing people from countless star systems across the galaxy, drawn not by any single faith, but by the pull of something they could not fully name. Records describe it as a focal point for numerous different faiths, all sharing the same streets and the same sense that this ground meant something. A person arriving in Jedha might walk past a shrine built by one tradition, then a gathering space used by another, then hear a form of prayer spoken in a language they had never learned, all within the same city block. That was Jedha, a crossroads of belief sitting on a moon that the galaxy had decided, somehow, was the right place to go looking for answers. The Jedi Order recognized Jedha too. At one point in the long history of the Order, Jedha was genuinely important to them, significant enough to leave a mark on how they thought about certain things, particularly the crystals found there. Kyber crystals, which Jedi used at the heart of their lightsabers, were embedded in Jedha's landscape and in its holiest structures. The moon was not just a pilgrimage site in a general spiritual sense. It was materially connected to the tools and traditions of the Jedi themselves. That connection ran deep enough that it shaped the sacred architecture of the city for generations. The most important structure on Jedha was the Temple of the Kyber. This building sat at the center of the holy city's religious life in a way that other buildings simply did not. It was not just old, it was foundational. Everything around it had been built in relationship to it, in orbit around it the way planets circle a star. People came to Jedha from across the galaxy, but many of them were specifically coming to this temple. Later, key figures in the history of the Whills orders would be described as former protectors of this very temple, which tells you something about how central it was to everything that followed. Now here is something important to understand because the records are careful about this. Jedha is confirmed as the home of one of the earliest civilizations to explore the Force, but the records do not explicitly name the Whills as the founders of that civilization. The earliest seekers on Jedha, the people who first started asking what the Force was and what it meant, are described in the official accounts without a specific theological label attached to them. Whether the name Whills was already in use then, whether it came later, whether those early explorers would have recognized the orders that eventually formed on their moon, none of that is confirmed. What is confirmed is the continuity. The tradition of seeking, of pilgrimage, of treating Jedha as a place where the Force could be listened to, stretched from that distant beginning all the way forward through centuries of galactic history. The institution did not collapse and restart. It endured. By the time the High Republic era arrives in the timeline, the Guardians of the Whills are already a formal, operating organization on Jedha with their own structure, their own practices, and their own relationship to the Temple of the Kyber. That level of institutional depth does not appear overnight. It takes generations to build something that's settled and that recognizable, which means the roots of what eventually became the Whills orders reach back further than any specific founding date recorded in the official history. The exact year nobody has confirmed. The exact moment when someone first used the name Whills to describe what they believed, that is not in the record either. What is in the record is a moon that the galaxy kept returning to, a city that kept growing around a sacred crystal temple, and a pattern of devotion that kept passing from one generation to the next, regardless of what was happening in the rest of the galaxy. Pilgrims from countless systems made the journey. They came seeking spiritual guidance in a way the records describe plainly and without exaggeration. This was not a trickle of visitors on rare occasions. Jedha functioned as a living, active holy site across enormous stretches of time. People were always arriving, always seeking. The moon held something that ordinary life in the rest of the galaxy could not give them. And underneath all of that movement and faith and architecture, the crystals waited. Embedded in the ground, housed in the temple, at the center of the lightsabers carried by the Jedi who once counted this moon as one of their own important places. The same crystals that would later become central to something far darker, in a time that no one living in those early centuries of devotion could have seen coming. Jedha was where the search began. Everything the Whills would eventually become grew from what took root on this moon, on a foundation laid by people whose names are no longer in any record, who asked a question that the galaxy would spend thousands of years trying to answer. Most people assume that to follow the Force, you have to be able to use it. That assumption is wrong. and the Whills orders are the proof. At some point in the long history of Jedha, two distinct religious groups took shape around a shared belief. They were called the Guardians of the Whills and the Disciples of the Whills. Both groups were made up of people who devoted their lives to the Force. And here is what makes them genuinely remarkable in the context of everything else we know about how the galaxy related to the Force during this period. Many of the people inside these orders had no ability to use the Force at all. They could not move objects with their minds. They could not sense the future or feel distant events unfolding across the stars. The midichlorian levels in their cells were not exceptional. By every measurable standard the Jedi used to determine Force potential, most members of these orders would not have qualified for Jedi training. And yet, they built their entire lives around the Force anyway. They believed in its power. They studied its patterns. They devoted themselves to understanding its will, even when they could not feel that will directly the way a trained Jedi could. That kind of faith, choosing to follow something you cannot personally touch or verify through your own senses, is a very different thing from what the Jedi practiced. A Jedi who senses the Force through meditation has a form of direct experience to draw from. The members of the Whills orders were working from something else entirely. Call it conviction, call it devotion, call it a decision to trust something bigger than what any individual could personally confirm. The two orders shared that foundation but expressed it in completely different ways. The Guardians of the Whills were the active branch. They attempted to sense the will of the Force and then go out and do something about it. They were believers who felt that understanding the Force came with a responsibility to act in the world based on what they understood. Their faith was not a private matter kept inside temple walls. It moved with them into the streets of the holy city and into the situations that arose there. The Guardians were practitioners of a lived faith, one that showed up in how they carried themselves, what they protected, and what they were willing to stand between danger and harm to defend. The disciples of the Whills were the contemplative branch. They listened. They sat with what they believed to be the will of the Force, took it in and held it. But they did not act on it the way the Guardians did. Their role was reception, not response. That difference sounds small, but it defined two completely separate ways of being in relationship with the same belief. The Guardians and the disciples were not in opposition to each other. They were two different answers to the same question, which is what it means to take the Force seriously when you cannot directly use it. Both orders were rooted in Jedha. That rootedness was not incidental. The moon's long history as a gathering place for Force traditions meant that these orders grew up in a community of belief. The Temple of the Kyber was central to both of them, not just as a place they walked past, but as something they organized themselves around. The Guardians in particular would later be described as protectors of that temple, people whose purpose was directly tied to what the building represented and what it housed. Their connection to the Kyber culture of Jedha was not decorative. It was structural. The crystals, the temple, the pilgrimage, and the devotion were all part of the same thing. Now there is a question that the official record does not fully answer, and it is worth being honest about that rather than filling in the blank with something that has not been confirmed. The question is what the word Whills actually refers to in these orders' names. In official canon, Whills functions as a religious identifier. It is the devotional lens through which both orders understood the Force, specifically the will of the Force. When members of these groups used the name Whills, they were pointing at something about the nature of the Force itself and their relationship to it. The name was not a confirmed reference to a species of beings. No official canon source identifies Whills as creatures or entities that the orders were literally serving. That is the canon position. The official record is careful about this. The name identifies a faith tradition and a way of orienting toward the Force, and that is where the confirmation stops. There is also no confirmed record of a specific scripture that guardians or disciples read as part of their regular practice. No holy text attached to the orders in a way the official sources spell out directly. The Journal of the Whills exists in the canon record, but its relationship to the daily life of these orders is not laid out explicitly in the official sources. What we have is the devotion itself, the practice, the structure of the two groups, and their anchoring to Jedha. The textual side of their tradition lives mostly in sources outside the main canon record. What that leaves us with is still significant. Two orders on one moon, built around a force they could not use but chose to follow anyway. One acting, one listening, both lasting long enough to shape everything that came next. The Guardians of the Whills did not spend their centuries on Jedha in quiet, undisturbed devotion. The galaxy had a way of showing up at their door, whether they invited it or not. And during the era known as the High Republic, it showed up with a war. This period sits centuries before the events most Star Wars fans know from the films. The Jedi Order is at the height of its power and reach. The Republic stretches across the galaxy with more stability and confidence than it will ever have again. And yet even in this era, when things are as organized and functional as they ever get, there are worlds grinding each other down in prolonged conflict. Two of those worlds are Eiram and Erono. The war between Eiram and Erono had been going on long enough that it had earned a name. People called it the Forever War. That name tells you everything you need to know about how long it had lasted and how little progress had been made toward ending it. Two worlds, locked in a conflict that had outlasted the memories of most people living through it, to the point where the original reasons had likely blurred into something nobody could clearly articulate anymore. Just two sides that had been fighting each other for so long that fighting was simply what they did. Jedha became the setting for a diplomatic attempt to end it. The Jedi sent two of their own to serve as brokers in this effort. Creighton's son and Aida Forte were the ones tasked with trying to bring Eiram and Erono to some kind of resolution on Jedha's ground. The choice of Jedha for this kind of gathering was not arbitrary. A moon that had served as a shared holy site for beings of countless different faiths and backgrounds carried a particular kind of weight when it came to asking people to set aside their differences and talk. The hope was presumably that being on ground that meant something to everyone might make agreement feel more possible. What it actually produced was something far more complicated. The Battle of Jedha was not just a diplomatic breakdown. It was a full collision of competing interests on a moon that was already managing the tensions of being a multi-faith pilgrimage site under pressure. The Jedi were trying to hold peace talks, while Jedha itself was becoming a pressure point. And in the middle of all of that, the Guardians of the Whills were dealing with something that cut directly at what they existed to protect. Religious artifacts were going missing across the Holy City. Someone was stealing objects of sacred significance from the spaces where the faithful gathered, and the trail of those thefts wound through the streets of Jedha and eventually reached the temple of the Kyber itself. For the Guardians, whose identity and purpose were bound up in the protection of that temple and everything connected to it, this was not a background problem. It was a direct assault on the thing they had organized themselves around. A figure named Te Sirek appears in the official record connected to these events. He is present in the investigations running alongside the Jedi's peace-brokering mission, caught up in the conflict around the stolen artifacts and the confrontations at the Temple of the Kyber. At one point in this period, the record places him explicitly as a prisoner of the Guardians of the Whills, held by the Order while the battle for Jedha is actively underway and unknown parties continue ransacking the temple. That detail is worth pausing on. The Guardians are not passive observers of what is happening around them. They are making decisions, holding people accountable, operating as an institution with enough structure and authority to detain someone in the middle of an active conflict. This is not a loose collection of individuals who share a general belief. This is an organization that functions, that has protocols, that treats its responsibilities seriously enough to enforce them even when the city around it is at war. Jedha was not a stable, peaceful place during this era. Even at the height of the Jedi Order, when the Republic was functioning and the Sith were not yet a visible threat, war was still happening on worlds throughout the galaxy. The Forever War was proof of that. The Guardians built and maintained their institution in that kind of environment, not in ideal conditions, but in the real conditions of a galaxy that never fully cooperated with anyone's plans for lasting peace. That is what the High Republic period reveals about the Whills orders. They were not a product of easy times. They were forged in the middle of everything the galaxy kept throwing at Jedha, and Jedha was far from finished being tested. A Jedi Master walks into a junk shop on a desert planet, meets a 9-year-old gifted boy, and quietly takes a sample of his blood to run through a scanner. What comes back changes the direction of the entire galaxy. This is the late Republic era. The Jedi Order is still operating at full strength, the Republic is intact, and the wars that will eventually hollow both of them out have not yet begun. Jedha is still standing. The Guardians are still protecting the Temple of the Kyber. Everything that the previous centuries of history built is still in place. And then Qui-Gon Jinn lands on Tatooine, and something happens that nobody in the history of the Order had ever encountered before. The boy's name is Anakin Skywalker. He is a slave living in Mos Espa with his mother, building things from spare parts and pod racing against alien competitors with reflexes that no human should be able to match. Qui-Gon notices him, senses something remarkable in him through the Force, and takes the sample. The number that comes back is so far outside the normal range for Force potential that it sits in a category entirely by itself, higher than any Jedi ever recorded in the history of the Order, higher than Master Yoda, whose count had stood for centuries as the benchmark for what was possible. The Jedi measured midi-chlorian levels because those measurements told them something real about a person's connection to the Force. A higher count meant the Force communicated through that individual more directly, more completely than it did through others. It was not just a number on a chart. It was a description of how deeply the Force had chosen, in some sense, to express itself through a particular life. And in Anakin's case, that expression was off every scale the Order had ever used. Qui-Gon brought this finding to the Jedi Council on Coruscant, presenting Anakin for evaluation and requesting the Council take him as a student. The Council tested the boy themselves. They confirmed the count. They acknowledged his power. And then they said no. Their reasoning was grounded in what they sensed. The Count told them about potential. What they felt when they looked at this boy told them something else. There was fear in him, deep attachment to his mother, emotions that the Jedi had learned over generations to treat as warning signs on the path toward the dark side. The ancient prophecy of the Chosen One described a being who would bring balance to the Force, and some among the Council believed Anakin might be that person. But believing in a prophecy and acting on it were two separate things, and the Council was not ready to do both simultaneously. Qui-Gon disagreed. He believed the Count and the prophecy were pointing in the same direction. He staked his conviction on it and pushed the Council to reconsider. After his passing, his dying request was that Obi-Wan Kenobi be allowed to train the boy. The Council ultimately agreed, though the reservations they held on to in that moment never fully went away. That is where the canon picture stops. Midi-chlorians carry the will of the Force. Anakin's Count is extraordinary. He trains as a Jedi. The picture from behind the scenes reaches further. If the Whills operate through midi-chlorians as the conduit, in the way George Lucas described in conversations that never made it into the official canon record, then Anakin's Count carries a different kind of weight altogether. It would mean the connection running between living beings and whatever the Whills are was concentrated in this one person more than any other the galaxy had ever produced. Whatever flows through that channel was flowing through him at a level that had no comparison anywhere in the Order's history. That is not a canon statement. That is what the behind-the-scenes material implies when you hold it up against what the canon confirms. The two tracks run parallel here, as they have throughout this story, and neither one fully resolves the other. What both tracks agree on is that the moment mattered. Something shifted when Qui-Gon ran that test on Tatooine. The Force's relationship to living biology, which had been taking shape as a concept across everything from Jedha's earliest Seekers to the Guardians standing watch over their temple through centuries of conflict, suddenly had a specific person attached to it. A boy with a number in his cells that the galaxy had never seen before. The Jedi would train him. The prophecy would follow him. And the question of what his count actually meant for the balance of everything would take decades to answer. The Force had put more of itself into one person than it had ever put into anyone, and the galaxy was about to find out what happened when that person made the wrong choice. The Jedi believed a lot of things about the Force. They believed it had a will. They believed it could be followed through discipline and meditation. They believed it connected all living things across the galaxy. But there was one thing they were absolutely certain about. When a Jedi passed away and became one with the Force, that was it. The identity was gone. The person dissolved. There was no coming back from the other side to hold a conversation. And then Yoda heard Qui-Gon Jinn. This happens during the Clone Wars, years after Qui-Gon's death on Naboo. The voice reaches Yoda unexpectedly, a presence communicating from somewhere beyond what the Jedi had mapped as possible. The Council's position on this was clear. It was impossible for a Jedi to retain individual identity after death. The tradition had been built around that understanding for generations. What Yoda is hearing should not exist, but Yoda does not dismiss it. He follows it. What unfolds from that decision is the deepest look the canon record gives us at what the Force actually is at its most fundamental level. Not what it does for the people who use it. What it actually is underneath everything, where it comes from, and what it holds inside it, that ordinary Jedi never learned to access. The trail leads Yoda to an ancient world. This world is described in the official record as one of the wellsprings of the Force, and the same record identifies it as the source of midi-chlorians. The exact name and location of this place remain unspecified in the official sources, but what it represents is clear. This is the origin point. This is where the bridge between living biology and the energy field that binds the galaxy together first formed. the place that the first section of this story pointed toward as the beginning of everything, the world that the microscopic life inside every living cell ultimately traces back to. Waiting on that world are 5 figures known as the priestesses. The official record describes them as mysterious force wielders who hold the secret to immortality. Not immortality in the way the Sith pursued it through power and domination and the refusal to accept limits. Something different. A specific kind of survival that the Jedi Order had never formally documented and had believed to be outside the range of what the Force allowed. The secret they hold is the ability to retain individual consciousness after death. To remain yourself when you become one with the Force, rather than dissolving into it the way Jedi tradition assumed everyone did. Qui-Gon had apparently learned something about this path before he was gone, enough to make contact with Yoda across whatever boundary separates the living from whatever comes after. And now Yoda has to go through what the priestesses require of him if he wants to learn what Qui-Gon learned. They test him. The journey does not stay on the Wellspring world. It takes Yoda to Moraband, a planet of ancient darkness where he faces illusions and temptations tied to the dark side's deepest tools. The official record makes clear that the path to immortality runs directly through that confrontation. There is no way to reach the secret the priestesses hold without first walking through what the dark side uses to pull people away from the light. The two things are connected. Understanding how to persist after death requires understanding in a real and personal way what the opposite of that persistence looks like. Yoda completes the trials. The knowledge passes to him, and through him, eventually, it reaches Obi-Wan Kenobi. The ability to speak from beyond death and to appear as what later becomes known as a Force ghost follows this line through the canon record. Qui-Gon to Yoda to Obi-Wan. A chain of learning running through the darkest period in the galaxy's history, sustained by something the Order had not officially known it was capable of. Here is where the story takes one of its most significant turns, and it requires being honest about the difference between what the canon record confirms and what the material behind the scenes shows. In the official canon, the Whills are not named anywhere in this arc. The priestesses hold the knowledge. The Wellspring world is the location. The trials on Moraband are the test. Nowhere in the episode guides or official summaries for this storyline does the word Whills appear in connection to immortality. But in a draft of Revenge of the Sith that never became the final film, the picture looks different. In that draft, Qui-Gon tells Yoda that the immortality technique was accomplished by a shaman of the Whills. The same draft describes immortality as a state acquired through compassion. Yoda then passes this along to Obi-Wan, telling him that Qui-Gon had studied the secret of what the draft calls the ancient order of the Whills, and that Obi-Wan can be trained to commune with Qui-Gon and retain his own consciousness after becoming one with the Force. That is the sharpest fork in the entire Whills story. The canon version places the knowledge with the priestesses on an unnamed Wellspring world. The draft version places it with a shaman and an ancient order tied directly to the Whills' name. Because this version did not make it into the final film, it cannot be treated as canon. It is draft material, a window into how this mythology was being assembled rather than a confirmed part of the official record. What both versions agree on is that the knowledge is real, the chain of transmission is real, and it changes everything for the Jedi who survive what is coming. Something ancient knew how to hold on to itself after death, and it passed that knowledge along at exactly the right moment. Everything the Jedi built over 1,000 years was gone in a single night. Order 66 went out across the galaxy, and clone troopers turned on their Jedi generals. One by one, on worlds spread across the Republic, the lights went out. The Order that had kept the peace, trained Force sensitives, studied the will of the Force for generations, was functionally wiped out in hours. The survivors could be counted on one hand. What followed was not just a political takeover. It was something more deliberate than that. The Emperor's agents did not simply fill the Jedi's old seats with new leadership and move on. They went after the idea of the Jedi. Temples were found and destroyed. Artifacts were seized or scattered. Every historical account the Order had kept, every record of what the Force was and what it meant to follow it, was targeted for erasure. The goal was not just to remove the Jedi as a military and political force. It was to make the galaxy forget they had ever existed at all. The disinformation campaign ran alongside the destruction. The official position of the new empire was that the Jedi had been frauds, that the Force was a superstition, that the extraordinary abilities people had witnessed Jedi use across their entire lifetimes were either tricks, exaggerations, or outright lies built up by an order that had manipulated the Republic for its own benefit. Generations of living memory of watching Jedi do things that could not be explained by any ordinary means were now reframed as the fabrications of a dangerous cult. For most of the galaxy, it worked. Within a relatively short stretch of time, a tradition that had been publicly recognized and respected across thousands of worlds became something people whispered about. Children who showed Force sensitivity were taken by Inquisitors, the Emperor's hunters specifically assigned to track down anyone who had survived the Purge or shown signs of what the New Order considered a threat. The pipeline that had once run from discovery to Jedi training to a life of service was replaced by something far grimmer. The two Jedi most central to everything that followed went as far from each other as possible. Yoda disappeared into the swamps of Dagobah, a remote world with enough Force presence to mask his own signature from anyone searching for it. Obi-Wan Kenobi took up a quiet existence on Tatooine, close enough to watch over the boy he had helped bring into the world, but far enough from anything recognizable as Jedi life that he could survive undetected. Both of them were carrying something the Order had never officially possessed until Yoda's trials with the priestesses. The knowledge that identity did not have to dissolve at death. That a Jedi who learned what Qui-Gon had found and what the priestesses had revealed could remain present in some form after becoming one with the Force. That knowledge lived in two people now, both of them in hiding, both of them waiting for something the timeline had not yet produced. For the Whills orders, the shift was just as severe, but expressed differently. The Guardians and Disciples on Jedha had never been the Jedi. They were their own institution, with their own traditions and their own relationship to the Force that did not depend on what the Jedi were doing elsewhere in the galaxy. But the Empire's attitude toward Force faith did not make distinctions between one order and another. What the Empire wanted gone was the idea that the Force was real, that it had a will, that following it meant anything at all. Force faith became something practiced quietly. The context that had allowed the Guardians to operate openly on Jedha, to protect the Temple of the Kyber in plain sight, to exist as a recognizable institution within a moon full of pilgrims, was being steadily dismantled. The Jedi's fall did not directly take the Guardians down with it, but it changed the conditions around them in ways that would become impossible to ignore. What the exile years produced was a galaxy-wide compression of Force understanding. Everything that had been open and institutional and publicly acknowledged was now underground. Teachers were gone or hiding. Students had no way to find them. Traditions that had taken generations to build were being carried by a shrinking number of people in increasingly isolated circumstances. The Guardians still had Jedha, but Jedha was about to have very different problems of its own, and the two men who would carry the Guardians' legacy into the galaxy's darkest hour were already living in the city that was about to become the Empire's next target. While the surviving Jedi kept themselves hidden and the galaxy gradually forgot what the Force even was, something ancient was already awake in the wilderness of a planet called Atollon. His name was Bendu. The official record describes him as an ancient being who had been living undisturbed on that remote world long before the Empire existed. He awakened not because of any political event or galactic shift, but because a Jedi named Kanan Jarrus arrived on Atollon, carrying too much fear and too much regret to function properly. Bendu sensed the imbalance and responded to it, drawing Kanan toward him and working with him to release what was weighing him down. Bendu described himself as the one in the middle. He claimed no allegiance to the Jedi or the Sith, to the rebellion or the Empire. He existed somewhere the galaxy's main factions had never thought to look, in the space between the two sides that spent all their energy trying to destroy each other. When the conflict eventually arrived on his world and both Imperial and Rebel forces began fighting in his territory, Bendu's response was to become a storm. He rained destruction on both sides without distinction, making his position on factional war as clear as it was possible to make it. There is a temptation, when looking at a figure like Bendu, to draw a straight line from him to the Whills, an ancient Force-associated being who operates outside Jedi and Sith categories, who holds a perspective on the Force that goes deeper than anything either side had developed. It feels like it should connect, but the official record draws no such line. Bendu is not labeled a Whills figure anywhere in the canon sources. The connection is thematic, a resonance between two things that feel like they belong to the same world without the official record confirming they do. No canon source links Bendu to the Journal of the Whills, to the midi-chlorian cosmology, or to anything that happened on Jedha across all those centuries of devotion. That boundary matters, and it makes Bendu more interesting because it shows that the Force had expressions in the galaxy that operated completely outside the frameworks any of the organized traditions had built. While Bendu existed in that isolated space on Atollon, the moon that had been home to Force faith for longer than almost any other place in the galaxy was going through something entirely different. The Empire had arrived on Jedha, and it had not come to observe. The occupation transformed the holy city in ways that centuries of pilgrimage and conflict had never managed to accomplish. Imperial forces moved through Jedha's streets and established control over a moon whose sacred significance they had no interest in respecting. The reason the Empire wanted Jedha had nothing to do with faith or tradition. It was the Kyber crystals. The same crystals embedded in the landscape, housed in the temple of the Kyber, connected to centuries of devotion and guardian protection, were exactly what the Empire needed for what it was building. A weapon unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, powerful enough to end a world in a single moment. The streets of Jedha became a war zone. Saw Gerrera and his partisans fought the Imperial presence through the city's corridors, turning the same paths that pilgrims had walked for generations into contested ground. The fighting was ongoing, and it was real. People were caught in it every day, and yet the pilgrims kept coming. That detail, recorded plainly in the official sources, says something important about what Jedha represented and what the Whills tradition had built over all those centuries. People were traveling to a moon under military occupation, walking into streets where active conflict was happening because they were hungry for answers to spiritual questions that nowhere else in the galaxy could address. The faith that had drawn visitors to Jedha since before recorded history was still pulling people toward it, even when arriving there was genuinely dangerous. Whatever the moon carried, whatever the Temple of the Kyber meant to the people who sought it out, it was worth the risk. The novel Guardians of the Whills, set roughly 6 months before the events of Rogue One, shows what the occupation had done to two of the people who had devoted their lives to that tradition. Chirrut Imwe and Bazay Malbus had both been guardians. Both had grown up inside the Order, trained inside it, understood their lives through it. The occupation pulled them in opposite directions. Bazay walked away. He had abandoned the ancient ways of the Guardians of the Whills and picked up a heavy repeating canon in their place. His reasoning was not complicated. The Order's faith, the patient trust in the Force's will that the Guardians had built their entire identity around, felt insufficient against the reality of what the Empire was doing to Jedha. He became what the record describes as an agent of retribution. The weapon he carried was not a symbolic object housing a Kyber sliver. It was a tool designed for the situation he was actually living in. Chirrut stayed. He remained visibly devout in ways that drew Imperial attention to him. The Guardian attire he wore marked him in the occupied city. The litany he recited, the practice of faith he carried into his daily life regardless of what was happening around him, made him identifiable as exactly the kind of person the Empire's broader agenda wanted erased. He was also blind, and he remained one of the most formidable presences in Jedha, despite having no measurable force ability whatsoever. That last detail brings the story back to something the third section of this video established about the Whills' orders from the beginning. The Guardians were always built on faith. Chirrut was the living proof of that idea, still standing in the occupied city, still practicing, still holding to something that the galaxy around him had spent years trying to convince people did not exist. The two of them together carried the entire weight of what the Guardians of the Whills had been across centuries of history, and they were about to carry it into the most important moment the Order had ever faced. Two former protectors of the Temple of the Kyber were living in the streets of the city that temple had anchored for generations. That is how the official record describes Chirrut Imwe and Bazay Malbus in the period immediately before the events of Rogue One. Not active guardians anymore. Former ones. The institution they had belonged to was still technically there in name. But what the Empire had done to Jedha had hollowed out the conditions that made the Order function as it once had. What remained was the two of them, and what each of them carried told the whole story. Chirrut's primary weapon looked like a simple walking stick. That was the point. A long staff that a person might use to navigate the uneven streets of an occupied city, unremarkable enough that it did not immediately announce itself as anything more than a mobility aid. But it was a weapon, and a deadly one in the right hands, and built into it, at its core, was a Kyber sliver. The official record describes that sliver as a symbolic source of inner illumination, a physical object that tied the person carrying it to the same tradition of crystal devotion the Guardians had maintained since the Temple of the Kyber first became the center of their world. His second weapon, a light bow, was not something a person picks up off a shelf. The official record describes it as constructed as part of spiritual progression. Building it was itself an act of devotion, an expression of the same tradition the Empire had spent years trying to leave in ruins. In a city where the temple had been stripped of its crystals and its purpose, where the occupation had redefined what the sacred ground of Jedha was actually for, Chirrut carried two objects that made the Whills tradition materially visible. You could see what he believed by looking at what he held. The words he repeated, a statement of connection and affirmation between himself and the Force, became the defining expression of everything the Guardians of the Whills had stood for across centuries of history. He said them while moving through combat. He said them in the moments that mattered most. They were not a request for power. They were a declaration of relationship. A person stating plainly what they believed to be true about themselves and the Force, and then acting on that belief with everything they had. The kyber crystals that Jedha had housed for all of that time were meanwhile sitting inside something that could not be further from what the Guardians had dedicated their lives to protecting. The Death Star ran on kyber crystals. The Empire had come to Jedha specifically to take them, stripping the sacred landscape of the moon and the temple that had stood at the center of it for so long. The same crystals that Jedi had used at the heart of their lightsabers as instruments of protection were being fed into a superweapon capable of ending a planet. That reversal is the sharpest possible expression of what the occupation meant. Everything the Guardians had protected, everything that made Jedha the specific place it was in the galaxy's spiritual geography, had been taken and turned into the mechanism of the exact opposite. The Force that had drawn pilgrims across the stars to seek spiritual guidance had been converted into a tool for ending worlds. The sacred had been made into a weapon. Chirrut and Baze moved through all of that and remained themselves, one still faithful in every visible way, the other faithless in practice but still standing next to the man who embodied what he had walked away from, which is its own kind of statement about what that tradition had meant to him. Here is what the official record confirms about the Whills themselves during this period, and it is worth being precise. Nowhere in the canon sources covering these events are the Whills depicted as an active presence shaping what happens. No intervention, no guidance offered from some higher layer. What the Guardians carried into the final moments on Jedha, into the mission that became Rogue One, was carried through people, through objects, through vows and habits, and the muscle memory of a practice maintained across an entire lifetime. The tradition moved through the people who held it. That is what the Whills' orders always were in the canon record: faith without a visible author. Devotion pointed at something that never showed itself directly. The Guardians lived and acted inside that space for centuries, and in their last chapter, the two men who carried the Order's legacy did exactly what the Order had always done. They held their position, in the occupied city, on the sacred ground, carrying what they had been given and refusing to put it down. Whatever the Force was, whatever the Whills referred to behind the name, these two men served it to the end. Before a single frame of Star Wars ever reached a screen, before any actor had spoken a line or any ship had flown through any galaxy, George Lucas put a name on the very first page of what he was building. The story that would eventually become one of the most recognizable mythologies in human history was framed, from the beginning, as something that had already been recorded. Something that someone else, or something else, had already written down. That framing was called the Journal of the Whills. In the earliest drafts from 1974, the title read something close to The Adventures of Luke Starkiller, as taken from the Journal of the Whills. Mark Hamill, the actor who eventually played Luke, recalled seeing that title page from the early development materials. The idea embedded in that framing was specific and deliberate. The story being told was not an original account. It was a chronicle. It had been drawn from something that already existed, some record kept by something called the Whills that had been watching and documenting everything the audience was about to see. The 1976 novelization, released before the film itself, carried a prologue labeled as coming from the first saga of the Journal of the Whills. That novelization sits in what is now called Legends continuity, meaning it does not carry the weight of current official canon. But it shows that the archival framing was not something Lucas tried once and abandoned. It was present before the films, in the film's companion material, and it shaped how the mythology introduced itself to the world from the very start. In modern canon, the Journal of the Whills survived the shift. A verse attributed to it appears in the novel Aftermath, Empire's End, and the official description attached to it there identifies the journal as a guidebook to the ways of the Force. That is not a peripheral detail tucked into a footnote. It is the canon record confirming that the Whills produced something that functions as a foundational text on the Force itself. A document that was being drawn from before the films existed, that shaped the framing of the original story, and that made it into modern continuity as something still recognized and referenced. What the journal represents in the full arc of this story is the closing of a loop that started before anything else in this video. The Whills, whatever they actually are, were not just the inspiration for faith orders on a holy moon. They were, in the framing that Lucas built from the very beginning, the ones keeping the record. The ones watching everything unfold across thousands of years of galactic history and writing it down. The ones making sure the story survived. And here is where the behind-the-scenes material earns its place in the final chapter. In the 2018 conversation reported between Lucas and filmmaker James Cameron, Lucas described what his sequel trilogy would have explored if he had made it. Not politics, not war, something far more fundamental. He said those films would have gone into a microbiotic world, a layer of reality beneath everything visible, where the Whills exist and operate and feed off the Force. His description in that conversation placed the Whills not as observers recording from a distance, but as something active, something that shapes the way the Force moves through the galaxy and through every living being inside it. He made a statement in that same period that is the most direct thing he ever said publicly about what the Whills actually are. In a general sense, he said, the Whills are the Force. That statement was never part of any film. It never made it into anything with official canon status. But it came from the person who created the mythology and who held the Whills concept in his mind from 1974 all the way through to the point when he sold Lucasfilm and walked away from the sequels that never got made. The idea was always there. It just lived behind the scenes, shaping the architecture of the story without ever fully stepping into it. The gap between those two things, between what the official record confirms and what Lucas described in interviews, is not a mistake or an oversight. The official record preserves the ambiguity deliberately. No canon source resolves whether the Whills are literal beings, a metaphorical frame for how galactic history gets recorded, or purely a devotional label that eventually became attached to a text. The question is left open in every source that touches it. That openness is consistent across decades of material, which means it is a choice. What the canon gives us, instead of an answer, is the full shape of what the Whills meant to everyone who encountered the name. On Jedha, it was the name of faith traditions that lasted centuries without institutional collapse. In the High Republic, it was the name of an order with enough structure and authority to hold its ground in the middle of war. In the occupied city, it was the name carried by two men who represented everything the order had been, one still practicing openly and one carrying the tradition in the only way he had left. In the novels, it was the name on a document described as a guidebook to the Force itself. In Lucas's unfilmed vision, it was the name of the thing behind everything. The Whills threaded through this entire story without ever fully arriving. They were in the name of the orders. They were in the title of the document. They were in Lucas's architecture of the Force's biology. They were in the earliest framing of the films before those films existed. But they never walked on screen. They never spoke. They never appeared as characters in any story that carries official canon status. Whatever the Whills are, they operated the way the Force itself operates throughout all of Star Wars, present everywhere, visible nowhere, moving through everything without ever being the thing anyone could point to directly and say with certainty, "There it is." The journal was always being written. The record was always being kept. And somewhere in the layer of the galaxy that most beings never thought to look for, something has been watching the whole time.